Will Virtua Fighter still be relevant after almost 2 decades since the last numbered release? What does it take to return to relevance in the modern fighting game scene?
Oh, Virtua Fighter. The moment I saw Virtua Fighter was almost as impactful to me as the first moment that I saw Street Fighter 2. Great aunt and uncle used to have like a Filipino mart. It was called the Phil Mart in Daly City, and there's a bowling alley across the street from it. It's like in the strip mall. And one day the arcade at the bowling alley had Virtua Fighter. I'd never seen a 3D fighting game before. My uncle took me over there and gave me some quarters, and we just played Virtua Fighter. And I picked Kage because he was a ninja and cool as heck, but I didn't really know what I was doing. But that game was like, it just stood out. I was like, oh, this is stuck in my mind. I got mad love for VF as someone who came from that era, but I've never dug into it too deeply as a player. I guess if we want to talk relevance, how relevant is relevant? I was in Japan when VF was arguably at its peak. I studied abroad in Tokyo in 2006. I was in Tokyo because I wanted to train martial arts, and hi, Kinako. And also because I wanted to play fighting games. But the fighting games I wanted to play were like CVS2 and Guilty Gear and stuff. I wasn't really into Virtua Fighter. I had the greatest hits PS2 version of Virtua Fighter 4 Evolution. Everyone who played fighting games did. Oh yeah, get Kinako on the shot. It was kind of, if anyone has ever either downloaded Killer Instinct or bought Skullgirls because the tutorial was played up for them, they're like, oh, this will teach you how to play fighting games, right? Virtua Fighter was one of the first games like that, where the tutorial and the single player content was supposed to be so good that, we should just get into it. It's $20. And I remember buying it, and I played it with my roommates who didn't really play that much in terms of fighting games, and we all just mashed crouching punch against each other for like a couple days, and then I got Soul Calibur 2, and Soul Calibur 2 was the one that stuck. We had Heihachi in it because the PlayStation 2 version. In North America, I've never really thought of Virtua Fighter as being super relevant to the competitive or hardcore scene. It does have its own scene, but the scene was always kind of comparatively niche. A lot of the North American FGC in the old days was built off of either Capcom or Tekken or eventually anime games, stuff like that. 2006, when I was in Japan, there was another guy on my study abroad program who his name was Seth, and he was also a martial artist. I was the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu specialist, and he was a Muay Thai specialist. Though I'd done MMA at that point, so I'd done a little bit of everything. And he was there for Virtua Fighter. And funnily enough, I do remember an encounter where I guess he referred to himself as the second strongest fighter on the study abroad program, which is, one, it's funny to me that dude would just kind of size up everybody, and that in the process of sizing people up, he would understand that I am the stronger fighter between the two of us, despite neither of us ever talking about it. But it's like that scene in Hero where you got is it Jet Li and who is it? Is it Chow Yun Fat? No, it's not Chow Yun Fat. Is it Donnie Yen? And they just stare at each other? Yeah. But you know the one I'm thinking about, right? It's outside and it's like rainy and shit. Yeah, they do the brain duel, right? We didn't even do that. He just looked at me and was like, damn, I lost. I'm like, that's some hockey. That's what that is. He recognized my chakra levels. I got to do a better job of hiding my power levels, man. Anyway, back then, VF5 was the fucking game. Like, he was there for Virtua Fighter, and I would go to arcades and I would just see Virtua Fighter all over the place. It's kind of where you'd think like Street Fighter 6 and Tekken 8 are now. And if Sega wants Virtua Fighter to get there, that's hard. It's hard for a couple of reasons. I do think they have an opportunity to do something cool with Virtua Fighter, and that we might see some success, but it'll be a long road to get up there. And it's kind of anyone's guess as to how long-term of a bet Sega is willing to put on this one. If I were to think about what's looking good for VF and what's looking not so good, there are a couple things about VF that have a good shot at success. The 3D fighter market is not really in great shape. It's basically just Tekken. Soul Calibur dropped. It didn't do that well. It didn't get a whole lot of traction with the dedicated competitive community. There haven't really been other kind of mainstream contenders to the 3D fighting game throne. And if you like 3D fighting games and you want to play them against people, you basically got Tekken, and that's kind of it. So in any situation where that's the market, it can be tough to break in, because then anytime you do something different from Tekken, there's going to be a bunch of people just like, well, I don't like this because it's not Tekken. On the flip side, if you make something that's too much like Tekken, people will just be like, oh, I'm going to play Tekken because I'd rather be playing Tekken. Virtua Fighter has this legacy appeal to it. The old heads like me, like I, again, not a Virtua Fighter player, but the moment they announced that the beta was available, I went and downloaded it. I put the pre-order in my Steam account, whatever. Just because I want to see what VF is like, man. Also, crucially, rollback netcode means you can have a good time playing this on the internet with a lower number of people. One of the things about the old days, people were not really net playing fighting games too much in 2005, 2006, which was, I think, around when VF5 came out. So the market has changed a lot. It would be hard to get traction in the old days with Virtua Fighter because everyone's already playing other things. And you kind of don't want to invest your time into a fighting game if you want to play competitively if you don't have people around you to play it. So the kind of support that you need to get to make a fighting game feel attractive and worthwhile in the local sense, you need to get other people to play with you. And if they're playing with you, if they're playing that with you, then they're not playing the other games that they might have traveled to an event to play, right? So it's kind of a hard sell. But with good net play, like as long as a couple people want to play the game, you can play the game with them as long as they're in a decent range from you. And it wasn't like that before. So now I think it'll be easier for Virtua Fighter players to get more consistent access to the players that like to play against, which is nice. But also, there have been a couple generations of fighting game players that have come up in a world where Virtua Fighter wasn't really a thing, so they've only really heard about it. 09ers, if they're still playing, they've been playing fighting games for 15 fucking years, and they're living in a world that has basically been Virtua Fighter-less. So there's a lot of people who I think would be down to give VF a shot that we just didn't have playing fighting games when VF was big last. The fact that the brand and the characters are already established, that everyone's willing to give it a chance, I think is pretty powerful and should bode well. The tricky thing here is Virtua Fighter has kind of always been known as the fighting game that looks the least flashy. It looks the most like martial arts of any fighting game out there. It doesn't really have the outlandish projectiles. It doesn't have the crazy 3-story jumps. It doesn't have anime. I think that the first thing, I mean, other than Kage the Ninja, right? The first thing that I saw that's remotely edgy was Go, who's like the judoka who kind of looks like a zombie, right? I saw him, my initial thought was like, this is Kmart Iori Yagami. VF has a lot of fondness behind it, but it doesn't have it traditionally hasn't had the visual excitement that other games have brought, which I think is a core part of fighting games. Like, people like playing fighting games for all kinds of reasons, but one of the reasons is that they like to see their characters doing really cool shit. And the cool shit in Virtua Fighter tends to be a lot more subtle. Akira's Tetsuzanko, right? Where he sidesteps and then hits you with his shoulder, his shoulder and back, blow. I'm like, countless characters have done it. I think Akira's is the coolest, but it doesn't have as much crazy effects going on or crazy air dashes, air mobility, that kind of thing. It's just visually, it's a lot simpler, and that can have a different appeal. I'm really interested to see how people vibe with it these days, but there's a risk, of course, that it just kind of looks flat. The other thing that I think will be a challenge is, frankly, that a lot of nurturing a successful fighting game these days is less to do with the game itself and more to do with the experience that you're building around the game, right? So you have esports and competitive tours with prizes that attract high-level players. And the nice thing about those prize pools is that if you see high-level players taking the game seriously, that can motivate you to take it seriously too, because it's validating, right? You're like, oh, well, if these guys are playing for $1 million, then I played this game too. You might not be thinking, oh, I might have a shot at $1 million. Though, trust me, everyone who bought Street Fighter 6 in its launch year definitely thought, oh, I'm trying to get this milli though. But it can be validating to see, especially fighting game players that you care about, dig back into VF, right? If y'all know Fuudo, right? Fuudo originally made his name as a Virtua Fighter player. That's why none of us were surprised when he played R. Mika in Street Fighter. Like, oh yeah, the grappler makes sense. He's the rock paper scissors master. It could be really cool if Sega is willing to throw down the support to start enticing players who already have established brands to come play VF. And if they don't, it took Arxis and Namco and Capcom and everyone else, it took them a while to kind of learn how to do the esports stuff, and I don't really know how good Sega is at doing that. It definitely matters, right? It's an extremely powerful form of marketing if you can do it correctly, and if you're not doing it well, then the players will probably just stick with other games. So I think that might be a headwind. Honestly, the coolest thing about this is that it is the RGG studio, right? I believe it's the Ryuga Gotoku studio or the Yakuza studio doing this, and I want to say, like, because if you look at the combat in Yakuza and in Shenmue before that, it was like very Virtua Fighter inspired, right? Obviously, you can play the games, the Virtua Fighter games, in some of those games. I'm excited to see what they do for this one, because they've got to know that just making another Virtua Fighter is not enough. So I went back and actually looked at the debut teaser that they released for the Game Award. A lot of the teaser was highlighting the graphical fidelity. So there were raindrops and really detailed water physics when the person in the hat, who's probably Akira, does the stomp into the puddle, and then you see a lot of really fancy like water effects. There are aspects of what they're trying to show in that trailer that indicate that they're going for a level of visual fidelity that we don't really see other fighting games going for. Realism hasn't really been a thing that fighting games have been chasing for quite a while. I think they might be able to hit a level of presentation that looks more like a martial arts movie, which I think would be pretty cool and a good visual direction to continue chasing. The other thing I noticed in terms of visual appeal is that the camera work is looking a little bit more dynamic in that original trailer than it was in older Virtua Fighter games. So if you go back and look at previous Virtua Fighter games, the camera work is pretty basic. It actually doesn't look that much different from a 2D fighting game, because there isn't that much movement overall. You have screen shake, and screen shake is one of the effects that they use to make an attack seem heavy, but they don't do a whole lot to change the camera position, especially during the match. The camera work just shown in the brief clip of combat for the trailer looks a lot more dynamic, again, in a way that I think will sell the cinematic nature of the combat, which could be really cool. In terms of gameplay hooks, though, I think they're gonna need to get a little bit outside their comfort zone. Every fighting game franchise usually has a set of mechanics or systems that is kind of hallmark that they add to or that they modify from version to version. Virtua Fighter has always been a little bit more restrained than other games when it comes to their combat design, because it really is just characters doing martial arts moves to each other. There aren't as many kind of major systems that really funnel the action through specific design patterns. That's something which I think was fine back then and really fits the VF style, right? Both visually and gameplay wise. It's subtle, it's not flashy, it is interactive, it is very much feels like a martial arts contest. It's important to mention, I think, that because we haven't seen a VF in so long, game design in general has gone through multiple different trends and waves over the last 18 years or so. I imagine there's a lot of room to do unique gameplay hooks that don't feel like old Virtua Fighter, but might accentuate kind of the core identity of Virtua Fighter from a combat and gameplay perspective. So I'll give you an example of something which I think is VF-esque, but not something you'd find in a traditional Virtua Fighter game. Virtua Fighter tends not to be much a game of resources or meters or character-specific mechanics. And I don't think they should just add those, because then it would just kind of make Virtua Fighter feel more like the other games. But you could imagine, say, a system that gives individual characters different sub-goals during a match that are kind of themed with their martial arts gameplay identity. Akira is the karate guy of Virtua Fighter. Karate fighters are known for hitting very big and very hard. So you could imagine, say, giving him some kind of counter system or damage scaling system based on how often he hits a counter hit. And maybe, Virtua Fighter has stagger moves where you have to mash out before your opponent gets ready to hit you up and combo you up if you don't mash out fast enough. You could imagine Akira having longer stagger if he counter hits you more often over the course of a match. And only he would have that system, right? Because he's the karate guy, and that's how they want to turn karate into a gameplay mechanic. And the reason that I think of that as a Virtua Fighter-ish mechanic is it's a mechanic that says, hey, Virtua Fighter is all about the way your decisions interact with their decisions. So if you had that for Akira, you could imagine grapplers like Jeffrey, for example, or Wolf, getting bonuses to each time they throw, right? Each time they throw you, maybe the tech window closes a little bit more next time, or maybe they do a little bit more damage and stun or something like that. You can think of a system like that as making it clear for both players that this character is supposed to be throwing you, but both players have to decide how they want to play around that additional incentive. Or you have a sumo wrestler named Taka Arashi, and you have a game that allows for ring outs, sumo is the martial art of ring outs, right? So maybe you just make it so if he hits the signature sumo attacks, he gets a little bit more hit push and it makes it easier for him to ring you out. I think of that stuff as a fun little add to the traditional Virtua Fighter formula that gives you room to play and sell the characters outside of the core combat, but it isn't a whole new gauge or a whole new weapon system or something like that you might see in a Guilty Gear or a Street Fighter DLC character or something. One way or another, I think they're gonna have some stiff headwinds if they want to hit their previous heights, but I do think there's a market opportunity to do a really cool thing, and I hope that they do it. The challenge for them is gonna be doing combat that's still interesting and has a lot of visual appeal, while constraining it to a good PvP fighting game, because you can get away with a lot of stuff in combat design if it's just single player that you wouldn't want to subject players to once it's a multiplayer PvP game. So I'm really excited to see what it looks like, but it'll definitely be tough for them. Thanks for the question.